Test, test. All right, welcome everybody to Pro-Con at the Pier. Hey, this is our finale program. You're in for a treat. If you're walking by and you're not sure what's going on, come and have a seat. This is a public, free event. Anybody is welcome to join and listen in. This will be a 1 hour long debate today. And before we get into it, I just want to explain a few things. Number one, this event is a pro and con exploration of the issue of whether or not we should abolish immigration and customs enforcement, aka ICE. Now, this debate is not happening in a lot of the country. It should. It's an interesting topic. We like to talk about it, but what we find that, as the saying goes, there's two things you don't talk about: religion and politics. Well, I think that's awful advice. We absolutely need to talk about religion and politics. We have to, or we're never going to make progress on these issues that confront us. So pro-con exists so that we can talk about these really controversial issues, including whether or not to abolish ICE. So today, to help us with that conversation, we're joined by a raft of partners, and I will like to call them out. Number one, I want to say, person who is doing the illustration here is our artist Daniel. Daniel is going to be doing a live capture of today's debate. So as their debaters are debating, he'll be capturing the essence of their arguments visually. We also have the Santa Monica Public Library is here today. Santa Monica is such a cool library system because they have a pop-up library. Whether you live in Santa Monica or you don't, if you want to check out a book today related to immigration, just go to the booth. You can get a card. You can check out a book right there. That boat is full of immigration books, and they hope you check them out. Next to them is Action Civics California. Action Civics California exists so that youth can be empowered. They can find their voice. Hooray for them. They have a soapbox right in front of the booth. We encourage you to stand on the soapbox and make your soapbox speech. Next to Action Civics is the Constituents. The Constituents is a unique group because what they do is they help people find their local elected officials. Who's your state senator? Who's your state assembly person? Who's your local council person? They'll help you figure that out. And if you want to tell that person something like, oh, the parking on my street is awful, or I think we ought to outlaw whatever, they will give you the paper, the pen, the postcard, and they'll put the stamp on it and mail it to that person for you. So to another layer of civic engagement, the Constituents. Thank you, Constituents. Next to them we have the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles. Great for the League. The League is here for two reasons primarily. If you are not registered, they will help you to get registered. If you just moved to LA, if you're not sure if you're registered, you want to change your party, that's where you can do it. They also do something really cool. The state of California is one of a few states where you can pre-register to vote. If you're 16 and a half or to 18, you can pre-register, so by the time you turn 18, you're automatically in the system, you can automatically vote. So if you're 16 and a half or 17, go and pre-register to vote with the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles. Next to them, we have the Pro-Con booth, and the folks at Pro-Con are here to do a few things. Number one is they want to know what you think about the issue of whether or not to abolish ICE. So there's a booth there where you can go and take a magnet and place it on pro or con, and depending on where you put it, it will reflect your intensity of your viewpoint. So make sure you vote beforehand, and if you haven't, make sure you vote afterwards. I'll remind everyone again at the end of our debate to please vote before and after. We want to see if any minds have changed, and if you are ashamed to admit it to your friends or publicly, well, you can admit it on a little magnet board at the pier. That's okay. So that's that. And I also want to give a thank you to the Santa Monica Pier for allowing us to host this awesome debate. This is our third year of Pro-Con at the Pier. They have provided the beautiful venue. This is a 109-year-old historic pier. It's the end of Route 66. This is a storied pier, perhaps the most storied in the country, and we're very honored to be able to use it for public policy and a public space. I also want to thank the Arthur and Rupe Foundation. The Arthur Rupe Foundation is the one that believes so much in debate that they paid to have these pro-con debate series happen in Los Angeles. Not a lot of cities get it. We got it thanks to that foundation. So thank you to the Arthur and Rupe Foundation. Now, that said, this is, you know what the event is going to be. It's a 1 hour long debate. To help us with debate, we need to have two excellent debaters. We do. You'll hear about them. We also need to have an excellent moderator, and we do. Folks, I'm real excited to talk about our moderator for tonight. It's a woman by the name of Dawn Nakagawa. And Dawn is someone you may have seen on television, may have heard her on radio, may have seen her referenced in print. Dawn is a big name in the world of public policy. She's got her public policy chops starting at McGill University, Canada. Any Canadians here? Yeah, go Montreal. Got her bachelor's in international relations from McGill. She got her MBA from U Chicago. Any Chicagoans here? All right, Chicagoans. After that, she ended up working as a consultant for McKinsey, major consulting group, right? Then she ended up going to become the executive vice president at the Pacific Council on International Policy, major policy organization. And then lastly, her current gig, hands up.
Oh, there you go. Hello.
Teamwork makes the dream work. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Her last gig, her current gig, is she's the executive vice president of the Berggruen Institute. If you're not familiar with the Berggruen Institute, please check it out. They're doing so much, not just for Los Angeles, not just for this country, but internationally in the world of ideas and policy. And we're so honored and delighted that Dawn took time out of her very busy schedule to be able to host tonight's debate for us. So without further ado, folks, let's get this debate started. Remember, hashtag civil discourse. If you're tweeting about it, hashtag civil discourse. And with that, Dawn, it's your show. Folks, enjoy your debate.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, as you've already heard, the topic tonight is whether or not to abolish ICE, aka Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It was created in 2003 as part of the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11. It has several important functions, including investigating certain kinds of crime, like drug trafficking and human trafficking, representing the government in legal proceedings, immigration proceedings, and enforcement and removal operations. And it's the latter that's really the reason we're here. Under the current administration, there's been a rapid and pretty measurable increase in the activity of ERO. Increased deportations, expanded detention, and increased raids. Such activity has been met with a lot of criticism and great opposition, to the point where we are all sitting here talking about whether or not we should abolish the agency altogether, which is being considered by some lawmakers. So, we have two amazing gentlemen here. I am not an authority on this topic, but these two are, and they're going to present opposing views on either side of this issue. On one, we have Chris Newman is he's in favor of abolishing ICE, and forgive me while I read, but he is the legal director and general counsel for the National Day Labor Organizing Network. Prior to this, he helped found the Wage Clinic and Legal Program at, and I'm going to butcher this, El Centro Humanitario para los Trabajadores. All right, okay. All right, and here we have Judge Andrew Arthur, who has a really long and illustrious legal career, which I will highlight.
I wish my mother were here.
So he served as an immigration judge for 8 years. He was staff director of the National Security Subcommittee at House Oversight and Government Reform. He was counsel to the House Judiciary Committee for 5 years, and he's had many other roles and functions. He's currently a resident fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies. So before we get started, a couple of ground rules. We're going to start with opening statements by each debater. We'll start with the pro position, and then Andrew will have 2 minutes to respond to that. Did we agree on 2 or 3? 2. We agreed on 2. Okay, so each will have 2. Then I will throw a couple of questions in. The point really is to get a conversation started between these two, and I will try to drift to the background and allow them to talk. I will jump in under 3 conditions. One is unless you heroically resist the temptation to pontificate, I will jump in and make sure the conversation keeps going. If it gets too heated, I'll try to dial it back a bit, and otherwise just sort of keep it going if it gets kind of low. So that's it, and with that, I will hand it over to Chris. Chris, the question for you is, why do you think we should abolish ICE?
Well, first let me thank you for moderating the debate, Dawn, and ProCon for inviting me. It was really cool walking in here and hearing all the different languages being spoken on the way out to this beautiful setting for this debate. And it reminded me that people come from around the world just to visit this place because this is one of the most desirable places to be in the United States. And for me, at its core, the debate about ICE is that ICE is actually making the United States an undesirable place to live, both for immigrants and for citizens, and I think it should be abolished. I've worked with day laborers for the last 15 years to make sure that their civil, labor, and human rights are respected. Day laborers are primarily undocumented immigrants. I work every day not to abolish ICE, but to make sure that day laborers have the same shot at the American dream that I have, that my parents had. And I don't think of really abolishing ICE as a sort of goal in and of itself, but I think of it as a means to an end of coming up with an immigration policy for this country that reflects our national values and our national interests, which is not what we have right now. We tend to think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants, but in fact, this is a nation of colonizers that defined itself as a nation of immigrants by periodically updating its immigration laws to evolve with its constitutional values. And each generation is tasked with modernizing and evolving immigration laws. And our generation is failing. And it's failing for a number of reasons, but Congress hasn't been able to act on a bipartisan fashion since it created ICE out of fear and paranoia in 2003, and we've frankly abdicated our responsibility as citizens to what I think is a law enforcement agency that is rogue and out of control and undermining the country as a desirable place to live. We have a Congress that is broken. I'll wrap it up. And we have a president who I believe is a white nationalist, and therefore abdicating this responsibility to ICE is quite awful. There's 3 reasons why I think ICE should be abolished. First, it's failing to live up to its mission, which we can talk about. The second is that it is delegitimizing all United States laws and particularly having a corrosive impact on our already broken broken criminal law system. And thirdly, and importantly, ICE is undermining United States sovereignty by failing on the international stage to grapple with the complex problems of globalization, by failing dramatically and by illustrating the hypocrisy of the United States and its inability to live up to its professed values. So I look forward to having a good debate, and I really do hope that we can come to some agreement and even perhaps some consensus as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. You said a mouthful. Do you disagree?
I do. Let me make sure my microphone's on before I start. Abolishing ICE would have ramifications well beyond immigration because the agency's mandate is broader than just immigration enforcement. It would also render border enforcement impossible because migrants would know that if they entered illegally, they could remain permanently. The impetus behind the movement to abolish ICE is apparently disagreement with the agency's immigration mission, at least of late. It should be noted, however, that the total number of deportations from the interior of the United States declined from just less than 250,000 in FY 2009 to 65,332 in FY 2016. That's 7 years. A 73% increase. A decrease. Criminal removals fell 60% between FY 2010 and FY 2016, when only 60,318 criminals were removed from the interior. Despite the hype, the number of removals under the Trump administration from the interior is higher than it was under the last administration, but well below these earlier highs. There were just 81,603 interior removals in FY 2017, and the vast majority of those, 67,859, were individuals who had criminal records. Much of the motivation for the Abolish ICE movement appears to be a response to the President's rhetoric and policies over which the agency has little, if any, control. Abolishing ICE would require the creation of another agency with the same mission because the immigration laws, by and large, are on the books for very important reasons and must be enforced. If you care about immigration, you would not abolish but support ICE and its mission. As civil rights icon Barbara Jordan, the first African-American woman elected to Congress, stated, quote, "If we cannot control illegal immigration, we cannot sustain our national interest in legal immigration. Those who come here illegally and those who hire them will destroy the credibility of our immigration policies and their implementation. In the course of that, I fear, they will destroy our commitment to immigration itself." Thank you for inviting me to discuss this important issue. I look forward to it.
So, Chris, I wanted to give you a chance to dig a little deeper on and go specific on what do you think that ICE is doing wrong, and is it new, or has it always just been a flawed agency in your mind?
It is new. ICE didn't exist before 9/11. In fact, we didn't even actually use the word homeland in sort of, American discourse before 9/11. It was created, like I said, as an agency after 9/11 out of fear and paranoia, and in part because we have a broken Congress, it's been able to sort of define its own mission by embellishing and creating phantom threats that actually don't exist, and is therefore, in my view, undermining the rule of law. And we think of it as this sort of inexorable thing that we would have a federal police force. In fact, again, it's a relatively sort of new federal agency, but it has become one of the biggest law enforcement agencies in the history of the world. We spent $18 billion last year on immigration enforcement. And just to give you sort of a point of comparison, we spent $14 billion for all of the other law enforcement at the federal level, including the FBI and the DEA. ICE, has a $7 billion budget, and despite that, it has only been able to deport the numbers of people at its sort of maximum effort that were just described by my opponent. Try to imagine, seriously, the amount of investment that we would have to make as a country to actually physically remove 11 million people who are estimated to be out of status in the United States. Think about what that would cost, both in terms of dollars and also in terms of just our national values, in terms of running into neighborhoods, terrorizing families, rounding up and removing people. People have watched around the world in horror as the United States has caged and separated children, as President Trump has literally engaged in state-sponsored kidnapping.
But wait, Chris, let me stop you there, because actually, see, it's not ICE that actually does that, right? The separation of families at the border is done by CBP, right? The Customs and Border Patrol. It's not actually ICE that's been responsible for that.
Totally,
but wait, let me go back for a sec. You said that they're phantom threats. What about drug trafficking? What about human trafficking? Aren't those actually real crimes that need to be investigated and rooted out?
Sure, and let's return to this point, because again, I think, like I said, the world is focused in on what the United States is doing in terms of caging families and literally separating mothers from their children. And you're quite right to point out that ICE is not the one that is sort of doing from finish to end that separation. But they are involved, and in many ways it's sort of a symbol of their failure as an agency. People are apprehended by the Border Patrol, and the President of the United States recently was at an event at the Border Patrol and referred to it as the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, didn't even know the name of its own law enforcement agency. They apprehend the individuals. ICE then serves as a sort of transfer conduit to HHS. They can hold people for 72 hours, and they remove people from the Border Patrol to HHS, where, again, children are being separated perhaps permanently from their parents. That is ICE's role in this literally human rights crisis that we are experiencing on our watch in 2018 in the United States, a domestic human rights crisis.
Okay, Andrew, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that. So, if the point is that that this agency, maybe culturally or whatever, is somehow corrupted, right? And not so much the mission they're tasked with, but the way they're going about it is actually destructive. Would you not advocate for reforming that, for changing that in some way?
As we say in court, that assumes a fact, not an evidence. What ICE actually does is they enforce the laws as written by the Congress of the United States. The prosecution of individuals for legal entry is Section 275 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. HHS gets jurisdiction over the custody of children because of Section 463 of the Homeland Security Act, which was added by Zoe Lofgren at a committee hearing that I attended. I was actually there when the Department of Homeland Security was established. I'll tell you a very quick anecdote. I don't want to. Part of the reason why we have a Department of Homeland Security, it was opposed by Congress, so it was pushed by the administration, opposed by Congress. On March the 11th, 2002, Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Sheikhi both got extensions on their student visas for that they had applied for previously. If the names sound familiar, that's because they flew the first 2 planes into the World Trade Center. INS was such an inefficient agency that it didn't even know to deny visas to 2 known terrorists who killed 3,000 people. So the Department of Homeland Security itself is just simply a rearrangement of agencies that existed before. We've seen immigration move from the Department of Commerce to the Department of Labor. In 1940, it moved to the Department of Justice. And in 2003, it moved to the new Department of Homeland Security. It simply enforces the same laws that it's always enforced. We have the League of Women Voters over there. If the laws are bad, the people have the ability to elect new leadership to change them. If Congress is broken, I'm looking at the people that are going to make that difference. The agency itself doesn't do anything other than what the law requires. I was the staff director of the National Security Subcommittee at House Oversight and Government Reform. I can tell you right now that if an agency did something that they didn't have a mandate to do, my chairman was going to come down on them like the hammer of God, and my ranking member would too.
So, Chris, what's your response to that? I mean, so we abolish ICE. The laws still exist. They still have to be, they still have to be enforced. So if it isn't ICE, it's going to be another agency. And who's to say it would be done any different? I mean, does abolishing ICE actually solve the problem? Or is it really we just need to change the laws?
We positively need to change the laws, so at least we're finding some consensus here on the stage about that. And Congress has an obligation, but it has an inability to do this. And in fact, ICE has actually taken on a political role by it's sort of incentivized to prevent Congress from resolving what is a vexing political issue and a civil rights and a question of equality for undocumented people. It literally lobbies against efforts for immigration reform. And just to give you an example, we have the closest thing that exists to a national consensus in this country over something called the DREAM Act, which is namely that people who came to the United States as infants and as children should have the right to political equality, the same shot to citizenship as people like Lewis and Clark and others who colonized and came to the United States. Something like 9 out of 10 Americans believe that Dreamers should be granted a path to citizenship, and yet Congress is unable to act on that consensus. And instead, we're sitting here in Santa Monica conflating and equating Dreamers and undocumented people with criminal terrorists who committed grave harm to this country. So I would ask you, I mean, are you part of the consensus of 9 out of 10 Americans who believe that Congress should pass a law to offer a path to citizenship for Dreamers or undocumented children who came here as children?
The Center for Immigration Studies actually supported the proposal to legalize the 680,000 current individuals who are recipients of deferred action for childhood arrivals in exchange for certain critical amendments to the immigration laws. Right now, there's something called the Diversity Visa Lottery. 50,000 people who have no ties whatsoever to the United States are able to apply. Probably the most precious thing to me is probably my son, but the most precious status that I have is probably my citizenship. That green passport that I carry when I travel abroad is my shield. and the United States government gives away 50,000 paths to citizenship to individuals who win a lottery. It just doesn't make sense. We accept individuals into this country not based on the skills that they bring or their ability to grow our economy or our society, or even what they could contribute, but based on who they're related to. At some point, needless to say, the nuclear family should stay together. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to be immigrating somebody because they're the nephew of somebody who's already here.
But that's a different issue. I mean, I think we're both agreeing that the laws need to change, maybe for different reasons, but that doesn't say who should be enforcing those laws.
But that would be the trade-off that we would propose. That was actually the trade-off that the president made, and that was a trade-off that it looked like Congress was going to pass. But, you know, the question becomes why, you know, that didn't pass.
Well, in part because ICE and the ICE union opposed it, actually. And think about that for a second. A federal law enforcement agency with a union that first initially endorsed President Obama, no other law enforcement agencies engage in that kind of political endorsement, and then later criticized criticized Trump from the right and said that he was insufficiently anti-immigrant, despite what we've seen with the executive orders and the racism and all the like. And they literally lobbied against it. And what you've seen there, just even in asking that question, I don't know what your view is. I mean, you're representing the view of CIS, which is an organization that's been labeled by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. I don't know what your position is, but the idea of conditioning the rights of people who are unable to go to work, to go to college, to buy houses based on creating some conditions about the lottery visa, that's how the reason why 700,000 people should have their rights held hostage. That's the kind of thing that ICE is actually sort of injecting into the debate. It's sort of creating this inevitable paralysis such that ICE will constantly have a job to do, to go after the other, to go after the phantom threat. Imagine if we in fact did resolve immigration laws in Congress and act on a national consensus. In a sense, ICE would potentially go out of business. But instead, they continue to lobby for ever more resources, ever more power, and they engage in lawless behavior that, ironically, for all the talk that people have about undocumented immigrants who broke the law when they came into the United States, we have a federal law enforcement agency that engages in routine lawlessness, unprecedented levels of unconstitutional conduct, not just the immoral conduct like taking children away from their parents, but detaining people before having probable cause, engaging in racial profiling. And now ICE is even going beyond the United States shores. They operate in 43 countries and are encouraging Mexico, for example, to wall off its southern border. So we have a law enforcement agency that is out of control. It's sort of putting its own bureaucratic interests ahead of the interests of people. And again, if there's one thing that we can hopefully come to consensus on right here between an organization that the SPLC calls a hate group and I, who work primarily for undocumented immigrants, could we just at least agree that the DREAM Act should be passed and that people who've lived here their whole lives since they were children should have a shot at citizenship and political equality just like everybody else? Could we at least establish that consensus?
Politics is the art.
That's not the debate we're here to have.
Politics is the art of compromise. And with respect to whether we're a hate group, we're not. I mean, the fact is we're not. And if you're saying that I hate, let me just give you some examples. I named my son after the patron saint of immigrants, St. Finbar. I've been practicing in this area for 26 years. I would get every other Friday off when I was a judge because I was in a union. And they bargained for me to have every other Friday off. And I would take that Friday off and I would go down to Baltimore and I would swear in new citizens. So I don't really know what to say about that part, but let's go to some of the other things that were said. There's an Inspector General in the Department of Homeland Security who does a vigorous job. If there are constitutional violations, that'll be addressed. We have two parties in the United States Congress who don't see eye to eye. If we want to get laws passed, we have to have compromise between those two parties. And that compromise involves trading things off. At the point at which you say, well, we should do this, and that's what we should do, you're not going to have that compromise. As a staffer, I was able to get many bills passed because I knew how to cut a deal. Everybody's got an angle, everybody has an issue, Everybody has something that they want. You're not going to get something for nothing. Sorry. It's just the way it is. But with respect to, the so-called abuses, again, the separation of children is not something that ICE does. It's something that happens as a matter of law. Section 463 of the Homeland Security Act. The William Wilberforce TVPRA, Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, requires unaccompanied children to go into the custody of HHS and eventually be released within 48 hours. The separation occurs there, not because of something that ICE does. If you believe that the law is bad, you should go back to what Ulysses S. Grant said in his first inaugural address, and he said, "I know of no way to abolish a noxious law than by its strict enforcement." If you want to have people think that a law is bad, then you actually enforce it. The American people are warm-hearted people. People are sitting here on a pier on a beautiful evening having this discussion because they're interested, because they actually care. If you don't enforce the law is going to stay on the books and things will happen.
But what about reform? I mean, if the abuses are real, if there is this massive scope creep, if it's kind of an agency out of control, I mean, wouldn't you recommend for reform? Last year, there were over 1,000 cases of sexual abuse charged against ICE in the detention centers. I mean, that is a data point in itself. Couldn't you support the idea that the agency needs to be reformed?
I think that if you have 1,000 allegations of sexual abuse in a detention center, and I worked at a detention center, let me tell you, I would do something every day. I would eat lunch in the York County Jail because I wanted everybody in that jail to know that the judge was walking around watching everything that happened. My correctional officers would have taken a shank for me, but they also would have followed the law because they knew they were watched every minute of the day. Not just by me, by York County.
Are you saying it didn't happen?
I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I can tell you right now that when a facility is well run, and York County Prison was well run, such instances are rare if ever occur. When they do occur, they're criminal action, and they need to be criminally prosecuted. But again, it sounds like the real issue here isn't whether we should abolish the agency. It sounds like the issue is whether we should enforce the law. That's a different question.
So, Chris, just, to the point about whether it's scope creep or it's the way it's behaving now, Andrew's point of it, they are basically enforcing the law as this administration interprets it, right?
Right.
And some other agency could do that. So let's say that's fine. But what we do have an issue with is the way they're going about it, the abuses that are involved, the scope creep, the lobbying, and so on. Couldn't we just reform the agency? Why abolish it?
Well, first to return to this point about the detention abuse, the Inspector General that you referred to earlier just released a report sort of citing gross negligence and sort of indifference to all of the different types of detention abuses that are going on. So the agency has been incapable of policing itself. And you had asked an earlier question that I didn't get to because we got sidetracked by talking about the domestic human rights crisis of separating mothers from their children. And that was a question about some of the quote-unquote legitimate law enforcement functions that ICE engages in. ICE is actually sort of two law enforcement agencies in one, as you said in your opening. There's HSI, which goes after sort of international, transnational crime, and then there's ERO, which deports people. A letter was recently sent to the Secretary of Homeland Security by 16 of the different special agents in charge of what we consider, I think most of us, the legitimate law enforcement functions, asking if they could just be removed completely from ICE because the association with this incredibly barbaric, unjust, irresponsible rogue federal law enforcement agency, namely ERO, was undermining their ability to engage in, investigation of transnational crimes. How ironic would it be at the end of the Trump administration if after the Newman report comes out, we learn of unprecedented international crime committed by a guy who illegally colludes with foreign governments to get elected and then sort of masks and conceals his legitimacy as one of the most illegitimate presidents in the history of the United States by bashing domestic workers, by bashing car wash workers and farm workers, and by sort of propagating, again, this mythology. It's hard to even continue in a debate where we're sort of equating what happened in 9/11 with the circumstances of 11 million people who live among us, who do work and functions and participate in our society without full rights. So no, ICE does need to be abolished. And yes, immigration laws do need to be rewritten. But there was never a point, actually, in U.S. history when you look back and say, you know what, that was the time when we got it right. That's when we had the right mixture of visas and the proper line. That's all a bunch of baloney. There's never been. Actually, U.S. immigration law is riddled, like our history, with white supremacy and with the advancement of the freedom of movement for white males, but not for others. And so we have an obligation, as previous generations have, whether it was in undoing the Chinese Exclusion Act, in dealing with Korematsu, we have an obligation to update immigration laws to comport with our constitutional values.
So that's very good. We're gonna open it up to questions, but just before we do that, back to your point about sort of the lottery system and our immigration system not really taking into account our economic needs. Is ICE the agency that's really going to do that effectively? Shouldn't we have immigration adjudication, I don't know, sort of with an eye to those kinds of things under an agency that cares, whether it be the Department of Labor or the Department of Treasury? In the past, immigration was sort of adjudicated by multiple agencies or had, lines of reporting to different agencies. Now, it's treated like terrorism management. So wouldn't we be better off changing the immigration system and putting it somewhere else?
Well, that's exactly what we did in the Homeland Security Act. The Immigration and Naturalization Service actually used to be, it was the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. And at the same time, it also adjudicated visas for individuals who were in the United States. The Homeland Security Act actually separated out the two functions. There was supposed to be an immigration enforcement agency and then U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. The immigration agency got merged with Customs somehow, never have figured out how that happened, and broken into two separate agencies, ICE and CBP. So we actually do separate out those two functions right now, where traditionally they had been done together, which was, sort of a, and believe me, I worked for the agency, and I would give advice to the enforcement unit one minute, and I'd give advice to the adjudications unit the next. So it did have a schizophrenic mission. The letter that was referred to earlier doesn't refer to the barbaric actions of the ERO guys, just to give you an idea. But it actually says that because of sanctuary policies and because of a lot of hyperbole, like we've heard today, that the agency, HSI, is unable to carry out its mission. It goes after child pornography. It goes after, actually there's an agency, there's a section that does child pornography. They go after foreign cash smuggling to the United States when despots attempt to park their money in the United States to go after that. ICE actually has a number of different missions. But again, ERO doesn't carry out a mission that's any different than it's contained in 8 United States Code. They enforce the law as Congress has passed it. If Congress wants to change the law, change the law.
All right, so let's open it up to questions from the audience. Anybody? Okay, back here. Yes. Here, he's gonna come over with a mic.
For Andrew, you gave to us perhaps.
What about the speaker? You got to turn.
Okay, you gave to us perhaps as part of the hyperbole you were talking about, your highest priority as an American citizen, your citizenship. I'm wondering what you think this whole debate would be like if instead of our highest priority being our citizenship, it was our humanity.
It's an excellent question. I didn't say that my highest priority was. The most precious status that I have is my United States citizenship. And part of that is the institutions on which this country has been built. Respect for the rule of law is one, certainly, but also respect for humanity itself. How many times have American troops liberated death camps, freed people. How many times have American values swept across the world? So, yes, absolutely. Part of being an American citizen is embracing those values of equality before the law, of the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience. So, yeah, I do agree with you on that. Certainly, with respect to how that translates to this, the laws need to be enforced. They need to be enforced humanely, but the laws need to be enforced.
Okay. How about here?
Hold on a second.
I'd like to, first of all, thank you all for a very illuminating debate and for raising very important questions. I have a question for you, Chris. I'm deeply concerned about the issue of abolishing ICE. Is this the wrong target? Whereas we should really be abolishing the detention system entirely, particularly the for-profit detention systems that are profoundly abusing human rights throughout the country. This is 3/4 of these, this is part of mass incarceration. They did not exist prior to the 1980s. It was Reagan that brought these in. And I'm particularly concerned because I'm worried that this will play into Trump's hands. You know, he has called this immigration the beating heart of the election, the midterm election. And he's going to play this up, that somehow abolishing ICE will bring about lawlessness, threat to law and order. This is the old, Southern strategy coded rhetoric of the racism that's inherent in Trump.
Yep.
I'm very afraid of this as well. So it's two issues. One, the wrong target, and second, playing into Trump's hands.
Well, on the first point, I completely agree. I think we should think of immigration reform as part of an effort to do criminal justice reform as well. And I am an abolitionist both when it comes to deportation and in terms of mass incarceration. And we should not, in my view, spend $2 billion of federal taxpayer money to pay for-profit prison companies to cage children, nor should they cage other communities of color who have been criminalized, which I think it illustrates an important point, which I think rebuts many of the arguments raised, which is that there's often a dissonance between what's legal and what's just. And ICE is widening that distance rather than closing it in a variety of contexts. But that's the first question. On the second question of whether or not this plays into the backlash hand and whether this fit into Trump for his electoral strategy, I got to be honest. I find hashtag abolish ICE to be somewhat annoying. I think that the person who wrote it didn't himself know the difference between ICE and the CDP, but I have spent the last 15 years of my life working to bring deportations down to zero because I am a deportation abolitionist, and I think rather than sort of continue to have this sort of path of fear and uncertainty and paranoia where we're constantly looking at each other and saying who belongs and who doesn't, and if that's going to inexorably be the United States immigration policy from here on, I don't want that. I think that we should have a policy that aspires to bring deportations down to zero. I think we can achieve that. And so if there's one thing that the hashtag Abolish ICE has done, using sort of Overton window theory of political theory, it's expanded the range of what's possible in terms of how we imagine and reimagine what immigration policy should look like. And I would submit to you that we absolutely should envision and create an immigration policy that doesn't rely on a lawless agency that engages in extreme acts of cruelty, barbarism, and human rights violations, as we've seen with ICE. It is possible, and so I think even if in the short term, we're sort of playing into Trump, it's hard to imagine, a backlash any further than what we already have now. We need to expand beyond, for example, the DREAM Act, the idea of what's possible for an immigration policy. Because this is not just an issue that is affecting the United States. It's around the entire world. The idea of reconciling globalization and the free movement of goods and capital, the free movement of people. And if we can't figure it out in this country, which country is going to figure it out?
Yeah. Okay. So many questions. Okay, here. Chris alluded to Japanese internment in reference to the cases where we've actually gone back and admitted fault and that wasn't a good idea. And I was just curious if you felt that, are there any situations where you would advocate if a
law such an unjust practice as interning our own citizens? Is there a line that you would say maybe this agency should revolt against its mission?
You know, it's interesting because it was only in the Trump travel ban case that the Supreme Court actually rebutted Korematsu. It's important to bring up the fact that Korematsu didn't involve the internment of Japanese nationals. It involved the internment of United States citizens. And somehow that always gets conflated in this. With respect to whether there are any laws that are so awful that they shouldn't be enforced. Again, when it comes to laws that are, you know, truly horrendous, in order to pass a law, you got to have 60 senators. Convincing 60 people who look in the mirror every morning and see the next president of the United States that they should do anything is sort of difficult. And then it requires, you know, the other body to pass it as well. So that's why when my first week at working on the Hill, I had to go to the Congressional Research Service. And I'll never forget, you know, they were going to teach us about legislation, how legislation works. And the lady walked in and she said, each of you thinks that Congress exists to make laws, but you're wrong. Congress exists to keep bad laws from being made. So, to that degree, that's part of the reason why our system works as well as it does. If there are
And it
laws,
still happens. We still get bad laws.
there are bad laws that get passed, but at the same time, that also leads to a political backlash against those who pass them.
And here we are.
Yeah, and we have a history of Congress legalizing the free movement of white men and criminalizing the movement of non-white men.
We got
Pretty cool.
3 questions back here. Another one. Okay, there.
Microphone.
Microphone.
I'll give you mine.
Right there.
Good evening. I'm Alice Yardom Hunter. I'm an immigration lawyer for longer than the combined time that you gentlemen have been working in the field. I just thought I would mention a couple of things.
Shouldn't you be sitting up here instead of me?
Please keep it short. The microphone is for questions, not for comments.
I think you should let us speak.
There were a couple of things which were said, many things actually. I've got a list of about 10 things which were said, which are inaccurate and which unfortunately muddy the waters of people who are trying to decide their opinion on various things. For example, the diversity lottery is not just a lottery based just merely on luck, not at all. In fact, it was brought about as a result of the Irish lobby, and it was for the purpose of having a more diverse population so that we don't have people just coming from small numbers of countries in large numbers, such as from the Philippines and Mexico and so on and so forth. And as far as...
Can you just prioritize what you want to correct so that we can make time for other people to ask questions?
Sure, I suppose if I were to say just one thing, that is that each of you has an extreme view with some inaccuracies, including the fact that there are not violations of the law. There are tremendous numbers of violations of the law that happen every single day, and they've happened for a long time. Some of what has gone on is new with the new administration, some of it is not. But if we are speaking to each other from these extremes, rather than fully understanding what the facts are and listening to each other more, we're not going to solve these problems or any other problems either.
Thank you, and that's in the true spirit of pro-con.
If I could just respond very briefly to the point about the diversity visa, it was largely enacted in order to give more Irish people the opportunity to come to the United States. My great-great-grandfather came here in 1825, and by the time, his kids came around, we couldn't immigrate anybody to the United States. Senator Kennedy, Congressman Schumer wanted more Irish people to be able to come to the United States. We got the diversity visa lottery. If you move to a merits-based system, what you do is you prioritize the skills and abilities that people bring to the United States, not the country from which they come. They could be the doctor from Nigeria. They could be the engineer from Pakistan. If you truly want to have a diverse system, you would move toward a merit-based immigration system, and that way you would also ensure that the individuals who come to this country have the skills and abilities to not only support themselves, but to grow the entire country. And that's really going to give people the greatest support for immigration.
Okay, we have a question here.
Sir, in following up from that, you had mentioned that outside of maintaining a nuclear family, that it was, quote, ridiculous that we're accepting immigrants via lottery who don't grow our economy nor possess skills. I offer you a segment of the poem found on the Statue of Liberty entitled New Colossus, which, while not codified as law, is universally thought to embody the American values that brought generations of new Americans to our shores. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Sir, I ask, do you believe that America in 2018 still ought to embody those values? And if so, how can you justify it with your statements about the, quote, ridiculousness of skillless immigrants who may not bring money to America?
Not talking about not bringing money to America, but not bringing skills to America that will enable them to support themselves and grow our society. In 1995, Barbara Jordan, who I referenced before, wrote an opinion column in the New York Times entitled The Americanization Ideal. In it, she paid tribute to our country's history as a nation of immigrants. This did not distract her, however, from asserting that a well-regulated system of legal immigration is in our national interest. In earlier testimony, she had described Americanization in the immigration context as the sharing of such American values as the belief in liberty, democracy, and equal opportunity. Barbara Jordan herself actually said that absent a compelling national interest, immigration should be based on merit, should be based on skills. And there were two compelling national interests that she put out there, and I agree with them. One is the nuclear family, and the other is asylum and refugee. Other than that, Barbara Jordan, the first African-American woman elected to the United States Congress from the South, civil rights icon, believed that we should have a system that's based on merit.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. I think somebody, do you have your hand up? And then we have to go to closing statements, right? Okay.
What relationship, if any, does U.S. foreign policy have with the flood of immigration?
Which one of us is that for?
For both of you.
Actually, that's a very critical point because the immigration policy is very tightly tied to the foreign policy of the United States. The Supreme Court has found that on many occasions, and in fact, that the two tie together, and for that reason, the non-political branch, the judiciary, is generally excludes itself from questions of immigration because of how tightly tied it is to foreign policy and the lack of expertise that the judiciary has in foreign policy.
That's a wonderful question that would require a lot of time to explore, but I think a simple point to make is that we have fought wars to open markets and to exploit resources from foreign lands and to create essentially, for those of us who are lucky enough to have a United States passport, a sort of borderless world, an open borders world, if you will, for those of us who have U.S. passports. And I think that it's impossible to separate our foreign policy, and particularly our policy of imperialism and engaging, like I said, in conquest and war for national resources, natural resources. It's impossible to separate that discussion from what we now have, which is a movement to erect walls, physical sort of walls, medieval solutions to complex problems like globalization, to block the free movement of people. And there's no doubt that there is a hypocrisy between the United States foreign policy that seeks to open the world in every other context, but then and says that, you know, again, U.S. citizens should be able to have free reign traveling around the world, but other people should be walled off from the spoils of the imperialist system that we have upheld in this country. That hypocrisy has to be reconciled.
All right, thank you. Okay, we're going to go to closing statements. Should we do it in the same order? Okay, no.
Do it backwards if you want. I don't care one way or the other.
All right, why don't you go, Chris?
I mean, I'm gonna actually sort of yield my closing statements to Laura Pena, who used to be the former Assistant Chief Counsel for ICE, a career ICE attorney, and I'm just going to quote her directly. Quote, "I became a lawyer because I believe in the rule of law and fundamental fairness, not to prosecute babies and send them traveling in planes alone. Our government cracks down on asylum-seeking families. We are witnessing mass violations of constitutional and international laws that uphold the right to family unity, to protection of asylum seekers from criminal prosecution, and the rights of children to live free from harm." Quote, "As a former ICE attorney, I am laying down the prosecution's sword and picking up the shield to defend those most vulnerable in our society. Our integrity as a democracy relies upon it." Abolish ICE is a hashtag that brought us together in Santa Monica to discuss really complex issues that I agree can't be reduced down to just sort of simple sound bites. But it is a means to the end of hopefully establishing one day, because we've never had it in this country, an immigration policy that actually lives up to the ideals that we profess. It wasn't until 1952 that Congress even got around to lifting a requirement that you had to be white to naturalize as a United States citizen in this country. 1952, we talk about Korematsu, there were requirements, literal requirements. You're squinting. If you're unaware of this as a former immigration judge, I think then that's illustrative of something. Congress is currently unable to pass immigration law. ICE is actually preventing it from doing it. It should be abolished, and we should, hopefully through conversations like this at the bottom level up, build an immigration policy that we can all be proud of.
I'm familiar with the 1920s laws, and they certainly did allow people who were not white males to naturalize. But the I'm gonna.
What about people from Asia?
We can debate the bar.
Did I mention that I'm Irish? Anyway, Barbara Jordan, who I keep coming back to, would be dismayed by much of the discourse on immigration today. As she stated, quote, "We decry hostility and discrimination toward immigrants as antithetical to the traditions and interests of the country." I think we all agree with that. At the same time, she said, "We disagree with those who would label efforts to control immigration as being inherently anti-immigrant. Rather, it is both a right and a responsibility of a democratic society to manage immigration so that it serves the national interest." And we talked about the least advantaged people in our society. You know, it's great to be here. It's wonderful to be in Santa Monica, California. It's wonderful to be sitting in this beautiful place. But I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and it's not like this. I drive down Monroe Street, which, if you ever seen The Wire, is the center of the wire. And I see young men who stand on the street corners with nothing to do all day long. I get my car and I drive from the train station. The other day, I saw a person who was passed out in the street in a wheelchair. There's something called the Baltimore lean. There's so much heroin in my city that people get high and they can't stand up and they have to lean. If we're talking about the disadvantaged in our society, we need to give society a reason to put those people back into society. The fact is, as long as business has a supply of labor that they can draw upon, and they don't need to invest in our schools, the schools in Baltimore are god-awful. I don't know if you saw it, but kids had to go to school in winter jackets because there was no heat. If we don't give business and people a reason to invest in those folks, they're just going to get discarded. Those are the least disadvantaged in our society, and those are the people that Barbara Jordan was talking about. She literally said, and I know I got 0 seconds left, I'm sorry, hold on a second. I'm going to flip around for a second. Immigration policy must protect U.S. workers against unfair competition. The Commission is particularly concerned about the impact of immigration on the most disadvantaged within our already resident society. Inner city youth, racial and ethnic minorities, and recent immigrants who have not yet adjusted to life in the U.S. These are the things, these are the reasons why we have immigration laws. And the fact is, if the laws are bad, change them. but don't abolish the agency and just change the initials of the people who carry out those laws.
Thank you. Thank you to both of them. Thank you.
Guys, I want to give a big hand to our speakers tonight, Chris, Dawn, Arthur. Thank you so much for this debate. Thank you to the audience. You braved the cold, you braved the wind. It's the coldest fun night that we've had. Make sure you register to vote, visit the constituents, check out a library book, and vote before you leave. Put your magnet on the pro or the con side, reflecting the intensity of your opinion now after this very illustrative debate. Guys, that concludes the pro-con series for 2018. Thank you to our regulars, thank you to the new folks, and we hope to see you next year.